Thanks, Amelia, and good evening, everyone. It's a great honour to be here at this gathering of esteemed African arbitration practitioners. And we're here to launch the 2022 SOAS Arbitration in Africa Survey Report, entitled African Connected Arbitration Perspectives on Major Global Issues. As Amelia mentioned, there are flyers dotted around, hopefully with QR codes where you can download it. If not, do go onto the SOAS website. It's a really good read. As Amelia mentioned, Pinsent Masons have co-sponsored the report and the survey with Broderick Bosimo and Co. from Nigeria. And I'll just set the scene to the report, and then Daniel will take us through a summary of the main findings. I'm Rob Wilkins. I'm a partner with Pinsent Masons International Arbitration Group. I'm based in London, but I worked for a number of years and lived for a number of years in Sudan, and most of my practice is focused on the continent of Africa. As a purpose-led professional services business, Pinsent Masons prides itself on championing change and promoting progress. We've long been proponents of diversity in international arbitration, and that includes efforts around Africanization. And we're very proud of our association with SOAS and the work going into this survey and report. And this is not about altruism. This is because Africa is highly relevant and is going to become increasingly relevant on the world stage. We heard yesterday that it's estimated $520 billion worth of infrastructure projects are currently ongoing on the continent right now. And that's partly due to the infrastructure deficit that exists, but also due to the fact that Africa's home to the fastest growing and fastest urbanizing population in the world. And that growth is driving demand for water, for power, for transport, and those needs are being met by infrastructure projects which are often complex, which are often implemented over a number of years, and which often involve an international element. So for all of those reasons and more, international arbitration is going to play a role in the disputes that inevitably will arise on those projects. So arbitration in Africa is very relevant, and this report is extremely timely. Just to set the scene as to what the report covers, the survey sought to present the views of African arbitration practitioners on a number of global and continent-wide events. Firstly, to understand the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on arbitral practice in Africa, and also to look at the preparedness and awareness of African practitioners around climate change. Now, those two issues are not new, they've been looked at before, but what's unique about this survey and report is that they're being looked at from an African perspective and providing much needed African voices on those issues. The survey also looked at whether the expected increase in construction disputes was starting to filter through and how those disputes were indeed being resolved. And finally, we've heard a lot about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the survey sought the respondents' views on the level of awareness and how the free trade agreement is expected to impact on their practices. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Daniel, who'll run you through a summary of the findings.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'll go straight to the findings, but first I'll introduce myself and my firm. My name is Daniel Inweze. I work with Broderick Bosimo and Company. Broderick Bosimo and Company is a firm in Nigeria, a boutique law firm focused in arbitration, commercial arbitration and litigation. Now, because we're a firm that's interested in the development of arbitration in Africa, and we believe that at the backbone of that is data gathering and the work that Dr. Emilia is currently doing. So that's why the partnership was an easy one for us to get into. Thank you very much, Dr. Emilia. Now, the scope of the research has already been shared, so I'll just go straight. We have very few minutes, but before I start, I'll simply say that whatever I'm going to say would not cover the report. So please download the report and read. So for the COVID-19, we noticed that arbitration continued even during the COVID-19 period. Protocols came out, but we specifically looked at the AAA protocol, and we found that there was a level of engagement and awareness of that protocol. There were also other challenges like technical issues during that period, which made some arbitration proceedings stop. Some continued with so much challenges, and some had to suspend until the end of the pandemic. I'll go straight to climate change. Climate change, a vast majority reported that climate affected the practice of arbitration in Africa, while about 37% said even though it affected, they felt climate change was more of a broader issue that affects everybody than specifically arbitration. However, those who believe that climate change affected the practice of arbitration have started taking steps to reduce their carbon footprint within the African community. Now, there's been a rise in infrastructure and construction disputes, and as such, there's also been a rise of infrastructure projects and construction projects, as well as disputes. Definitely, because there are projects going on, there'll be disputes coming up from it. But arbitration has been seen to be the most preferred means for settling these disputes. And this is because of the complex nature of the kind of disputes that emanate from these transactions. And finally, the African Free Trade Agreement, it cannot be overemphasized, is important. And within the scope of what the survey covered, we found out that the African Free Trade Agreement the protocol for settlement of disputes doesn't cover non-state parties. And parties and respondents felt that arbitration would be the best way to settle disputes emanating between individuals in those kinds of transactions. There's also a question as to whether African commercial courts should be established to settle disputes emanating from individual parties engaging under the African Free Trade Agreement. Now, I will close by just reading a statement from one of the respondents. The respondent said, an African commercial court would raise questions of how judges are appointed and their impartiality and the cost of setting up such a court, enforcement of their decisions and judgment. Thank you very much. This is the end of our presentation. Thank you, SOAS. Thank you, Alpha. We are really grateful.